For decades, Ron Howard has been one of Hollywood's most carefully neutral public figures. The former child star turned Oscar-winning director built an entire career and public image on being universally likable, the guy who played Richie Cunningham, then Opie before that, then went on to direct beloved, mostly apolitical films like Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, and Splash. He rarely waded into hot-button political territory, choosing instead to let his work speak for itself. So when Ron Howard finally broke that silence, publicly and unambiguously, people noticed. It happened at the Toronto International Film Festival, in an interview with Variety. The context mattered. Howard had directed the 2020 film adaptation of Hillbilly Elegy, based on J.D. Vance's memoir about growing up in a struggling Ohio family. Making that film meant Howard had actually spent real time with Vance, getting to know him personally during the adaptation process, long before Vance became a national political figure. That personal history is exactly what made Howard's comments land so differently than generic celebrity political statements usually do. Asked directly about the 2024 election, with Vance now running as Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, Howard didn't dodge the question or offer a diplomatic non-answer. He was blunt. There was no version of me voting for Donald Trump to be president again. He told Variety, whoever the vice president was. It wasn't a throwaway line buried in a longer interview about his film work. It was a direct, deliberate statement, delivered by a man who had spent his entire public life avoiding exactly this kind of remark. What gave the comment extra weight wasn't just the statement itself, but the implicit contrast it drew. Here was someone who had worked closely with Vance, who had spent months trying to authentically portray his life story on screen, essentially saying that whatever he'd witnessed in Vance's political evolution since then had left him deeply uneasy. Howard didn't attack Vance personally or rehash old grievances from the production. Instead, he framed his concern around the broader political rhetoric of the moment, describing it as troubling and worth serious scrutiny from voters. Howard didn't stop at simply stating his own position, either. He used the moment to encourage broader civic engagement, regardless of who people ultimately supported. "We've got to get out and vote, for whomever," he said, "but be thoughtful, listen to what the candidates are saying today, that's what's really relevant." It was a notably measured way to frame an otherwise pointed political statement. Less vote for my candidate. More actually pay attention to what's being said right now, not just to old narratives or past impressions. That distinction is worth sitting with, because it's part of what made the comments resonate rather than simply generating a single news cycle of controversy. Howard wasn't positioning himself as a partisan activist. He was speaking as someone who had a direct, personal window into Vance's story, through years spent adapting his memoir into a film, and was now watching that story diverge sharply from political persona Vance had adopted since entering national politics. For a director whose brand has always been careful neutrality, that kind of specific, experience-based criticism carried more weight than a generic celebrity endorsement ever could. Reaction was immediate, if not exactly explosive. Entertainment outlets and political commentators alike picked up the quote, largely because it was so uncharacteristic of Howard specifically. This wasn't Robert De Niro or Mark Ruffalo, actors known for outspoken political commentary. This was Ron Howard, Mayberry's Opie, Richie Cunningham, the guy behind Cocoon and Frost/Nixon, someone whose public image had been built almost entirely around avoiding this exact kind of statement for 50 years. It's also worth noting that this wasn't an isolated blip in an otherwise silent public record. Howard has occasionally faced smaller controversies throughout his career, including backlash over a joke in one of his films that the studio ultimately pulled from marketing materials, prompting Howard to publicly clarify his position on sensitivity, not censorship, in entertainment. But nothing in his decades-long public history matched the directness of his comments about the 2024 election and his personal connection to one of its central figures. In an industry where celebrity political statements have become so routine they barely register anymore, Ron Howard's brief, deliberate break from decades of careful neutrality stood out precisely because it was so unexpected from him specifically. He wasn't chasing headlines or trying to reinvent his public image. He was answering a direct question honestly, informed by real personal history with one of the people involved. Sometimes, that's exactly what makes a statement land harder than 100 louder ones ever could.